Hello and welcome to the First Impressions podcast. I'm your host, Martin McKeay, and along with my friend Chris John Riley, we record the official podcast for the Forum of Incident Response and Security Teams. We look forward to seeing you this year at the 37th Annual FIRST Conference in Copenhagen, Denmark. The dates are June 22nd through June 27th, 2025. And now we join our interview in progress.
Welcome to the show. Tonight we're lucky enough to be joined by John Stoner, Global Principal Security Strategist at Google Cloud. John, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
I'm very keen to talk to you about the presentation you're giving at the upcoming conference. Seems like a really exciting topic. Can you give people who are listening a little bit of an intro about what you're going to be covering at the conference?
I was fortunate enough to be able to speak at First last year, and as I kind of built my deck, I was thinking about it, and I'm like, "There's more I want to talk about." I feel like there was more that I wanted to kind of go into, and time constraints and everything. And so as I finished my talk last year, I started kind of thinking about, what are those additional things that I wanted to talk about that I just wasn't able to fit in there. And as I started looking at it, the idea of being able to do emulations and simulations of data is very, very important, both from an education perspective as well as for testing of your own detections and your hunting and your capabilities. But at the same time, one of the challenges that you also have is that an emulation can sometimes be a heavy lift, and so you don't necessarily run them all the time. But then if you don't run them all the time, then how do you make sure that the detections that you've written and you've crafted and you've painstakingly worked with work 6 months later, because environments evolve over time. And so I started kind of trying to think about this in terms of how are the different ways that we can be handling those detections? How can we be thinking about being better about keeping up with our environments that change and still being able to use these emulations, these tests, and keeping our detections current? And that's kind of where this talk started to land.
It's great to see kind of the growth of the idea from last year and then the continuation this year. I think it's very important for people to see things not just in isolation as here's a 30-minute talk, we're done, that whole topic's covered. These kind of things are a lot more complex, there's a lot more moving parts, and seeing that grow and evolve over multiple years, over multiple presentations is very, very important.
It's been fun. It's definitely been a learning experience. I think a lot of this stuff, as we're building this, you kind of think about it in your head and you're like, okay, yeah, that shouldn't be too hard. And then you start kind of working through it and you start kind of peeling that back and realizing that there's always those little gotchas that pop up. And I'm as I built this, I feel like I've tried to kind of stamp out those gotchas as I found them. But at the same time, I'm also totally aware that everything that I'm talking about here has a lot of moving pieces to it. And so this is not going to be a one size fits all kind of solution, but it does hopefully provide participants the ability to kind of think about it and go, okay, yeah, here's a couple of different methods or a couple of different paths I could take to solve some of these problems. So that's really my goal here.
I can imagine looking at the text of the talk, you talk a little bit about the differences between running these kind of emulations in test environments versus production environments. And this is something that I know I've come across, you've probably come across a lot, is people often have a test environment that either is not reflective of how production is, or their test environment is just production. Running these kind of emulations and running these kind of checks in production, it's a scary thing. Going back 5-10 years, if you ran Nessus in production, people would freak out. You can't possibly run this in production, and I hope we've moved a little bit beyond that now. Is that still a barrier that we need to fight?
I've kind of tried to bat this around as I've been working on it, working with it, and then also trying to think about, what are some of the potential outcomes that could cause pain downstream to the SOC analysts and people who have to respond or see these detections, right? So I've tried to kind of address some of those concerns as I've been building this. I think a development environment really is, I mean, again, it would be a full-time job plus 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 to keep up with the cloud environments, the endpoints, the versioning, the applications, the custom applications, the Kubernetes instances, all of this stuff, right? There's just so much there that I feel like, the production environment is a place where, we have to kind of take a swing at some of these things, but we also have to apply appropriate controls that, to your point, we don't freak out somebody because they see Nessus running in the environment, right? And so it's, there's some things I've tried to kind of build into this around some things around thinking about those kinds of things. There's risks obviously associated with it as well that we have to acknowledge. I think it's one of those things that, again, I might present some of those things. You may not agree with it. That's totally fine. But I want to go ahead and provide some ideas as to things that you might be able to do. And so, if your leadership maybe isn't willing to go all the way over to that, maybe they can at least meet you halfway, and we make some demonstrative progress in the meantime.
I think one of the dangers is that by necessity, the business earmarks sections of the network and says this is highly critical, therefore you can't do this, which is also a confusing situation because in highly critical areas, this is exactly where you want to run these tests and have those signals and understand how that area works and how your detection works in these highly critical areas. So you're kind of have that balancing act between business requirements and ensuring stability, but also ensuring that you are protecting the right areas of the network.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, one of the things I talk about as well is thinking about this an exception perspective, right? You're, running these tests. You want to run these tests in those places, to your point. At the same time, I also am putting a live weapon, so to speak, into the environment. And so, what are some of the mitigations that we can have out there to go ahead and say, you know what? Yes, it's running in this environment. Maybe it's not running, maybe it's not running on the correct systems. Maybe the right users aren't running it, right? Maybe the time of day isn't appropriate. So are there things that we can do to kind of say, okay, we need to have these run, but we also need to kind of call out those exceptions. And when those exceptions fire, those are actually the ones that are very, very interesting because those are not the expected ones. So again, it's a balancing act for sure.
You're talking about moving towards this idea of continual testing, which for I think still for a lot of people is a little bit of a target that they're still trying to hit. Like a lot of people run their 6 monthly Nessus scan, or they'll run some kind of threat hunt on a ad hoc basis over the year, but they're not really in a situation where this is a regular thing that's always running in the background. How far off are we as an industry, do you think, from getting to that point where these kind of emulations and simulations are always running somewhere in the background on the network? It's not the time of the year for testing. It's just something that's always constantly happening.
Yeah, I think I mean, I still think we're a fair ways off. I mean, I look at this and there's obviously, I'm using Atomic Red Team as my for instance with this. There's obviously a lot of open source tooling are associated with it. There's commercial offerings that are associated with this as well. So, I think there was definitely a thirst for it. I think there are folks that are dipping toes into it, which is always a good thing, and seeing what kind of success do they meet with it. So I think it's moving in those directions, but I think all of the things we previously talked about the balancing the business and the technical requirement, just the inertia sometimes associated with those kinds of changes, and then obviously the overall risk, particularly in certain protected industries, that all makes it really kind of tough to overcome those things immediately. The other part I'd say, that kind of spurred some of this was the challenge that, and I'm also looking at this maybe less from an endpoint security control perspective and more from a detective control at a log aggregation platform or an analytic platform, is that, even there we struggle with organizations maybe not even testing at the collection and parsing on a regular basis, right? And so some of this is also just even let's move it gradually out from the sim or the analytic engine just to the collection and parsing layer, and then moving it the step farther all the way to the end control layer. And so again, these things are gradual steps along the way, and different people are in different stages of maturity. I think if we can go ahead and say, hey, look, this is where you can be going, and mapping that as a course, we can slowly start moving folks along that way.
One of the areas that I think is often overlooked is that organizational buy-in for doing these kind of things. You have the technical side of things. As you said, people are investing in tools. There's production and corporate tools that you can just buy in that will do certain elements of this. But getting an organization to go from zero to where we'd like them to be, it seems like a large uphill discussion, especially when you start to hit environments that are not necessarily servers under desks. Like you're talking about multi-cloud environments, spread across multiple different regions, multiple different countries even. When you're talking about data sovereignty, where does that data sit? Can we run these kind of tests? Does the software support these kind of environments? What does it look like from an organizational point of view to really get the buy-in?
Yeah, I'd say it's tremendously tough from that perspective, right? In some ways, I think there's always that tempting thing to say, well, let's go ahead and, we're going to just turn it all on and see what happens. It's one of those things. I mean, I found that even as I was setting up some of my infrastructure and doing some of my testing, I was like, yeah, let's go ahead and see what happens, right? And chaos ensues.
Yeah.
So I think all part of this is looking at what are the things that I care about the most, or where are my biggest problems. Basically, going ahead and reducing this down to something that's much more bite sized, rather than trying to I like to think of it as boiling the ocean, right? We're not going to be able to do that, but if we can go ahead and focus on, hey, let's focus on those endpoints. Let's focus on this SaaS environment. Let's focus on those Linux servers in the data center, right? What can I do in a specific area to start making progress? And that's kind of how I started approaching this. There's a lot more that I can do with Atomic Red Team around cloud-based services, Linux, Mac OS. To be frank, what I've worked on so far, and I kind of talk about this at the end, is I've focused strictly on the Windows endpoint because, again, it's a nice, hearty place where lots of problems occur for organizations. And if I can start with that and make some progress there, then I can learn from that and iterate into those other places as well.
I guess also from a Windows point of view, you know what you're dealing with. Like a Windows server that runs on Dell hardware is the same as a Windows server that runs on other hardware. Unlike Linux distributions are a lot more, I'm going to say flexible, but also they're a lot more unique in certain ways. Logs may end up in different places. Things may run different kinds of services, and it's not a single beast. You don't just say I support Linux. You end up having to support the multiple different flavors of it.
Exactly.
Are there any other challenges that you really want to get over to people who are listening and people who are interested in coming to the talk? I know that you said that people who are going to be attending the talk will get a greater understanding of why testing and detection on an ongoing basis is critical. I think we can all agree there, and also the potential pitfalls when setting up ongoing testing solutions. But what else are people going to learn? What else do you want to tell people who are interested in attending the talk?
Yeah, I'd say a couple different things. One, I want to talk. I'm going to talk a bit about the overall pipeline flow because again, there are different testing points along the way, right? So this is not an all or nothing kind of proposition. There are different places that you can test. You can get value in a number of different places around those emulations. So again, this is from a crawl, walk, run perspective. I want to make sure that folks understand that even if I'm not ready to go all the way into continuous testing at the control point, there are other things I can do to still help create value for my security operations teams and drive awareness around detection. I want to share a little bit about what some of the things that I've done. I like to also talk about, oftentimes, when you first kind of do a project yourself, you realize all of the stuff that you didn't know that you uncover as you're doing it. And so I think there's hopefully some lessons learned that I encountered along the way that were things that caused me pain that I'd like to go ahead and make sure that folks don't have to experience, or if they do, at least they've been warned. So that's something that's there. And then even extending into a couple of other capabilities that are in there, talking about being able to measure your success rate, measuring your efficacy, those kinds of things. I think that's important as well, because at the end of the day, when you're doing these projects, you want to be able to sit there and say, okay, are we better than we were before? Are we seeing the things that we weren't able to see before? Are we keeping up with these? Are things working the way we're expecting it to? So looking at this from being able to measure things and being able to say, yep, we've made some success, and here are some ways to visualize those things.
It's very important from a growth and buy-in perspective as well to be able to present to upper management and say, hey, look, we're seeing, I'm going to throw some numbers, 67% of things that we're detecting. And if they say, how do I get this to 80? You know that's where we need to get to. And you get buy-in by saying, okay, well, we can improve here, or is 67% fine? Is that enough for us? So it allows you to at least see where you're at, see where you're going, and try and move things forward. So I think that's a great area. I think one of the dangers I love it when Google presents, because there's so many great ideas, great technologies, and things like that. But there's always that element in the room that's like, well, yeah, but that's Google. We can't do that. And I think what you're bringing is an explanation of how you do this, how you can implement this in multiple ways in different environments that aren't necessarily single cloud or huge organizations and huge outset from the beginning. You can start things very, very small and then build them up to where you would like to be ideally, and don't boil the ocean, as you said.
Exactly.
So is there anything else that we haven't asked about that you'd like to cover?
I don't think so. I think we kind of touched on a number of different pieces. I quite frankly am a little concerned, as I've been building out my slide deck, that the time that I have allocated probably won't be able to cover everything I've kind of jotted down here, which sometimes it's a good problem to have. No, I'm looking forward to it. I'm looking forward to sharing this. Looking forward to the engagement with the rest of the folks attending.
Great. Sounds good. Really looking forward to seeing your talk and meeting up in person in Copenhagen. John, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
You've been listening to the First Impressions podcast, the official podcast for the Forum of Incident Response and Security Teams. We thank you for listening, and you can find out more at first.org, and we hope to see you in Copenhagen, Denmark, June 22nd through 27th. Thanks and goodbye.